See you, and these are my students, and you have 20 minutes to engage them, and then here they are. I can't catch them all, but yeah, now we can see. Okay.
All right. Well, it's great to be here with you, and thank you for having me to share ideas on liberty with you. I'm here to talk to you about the case for open immigration or open borders, free trade, and free movements of people across borders. Uh, Let me make two important points about immigration controls, which is, of course, the system that we have lived under here in the United States for more than 100 years. The first point is they don't work. They will never work. They have never worked. All they do is produce crises. I mean, that's why we have lived under a decades-long immigration crisis, because of immigration controls. It's what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. And this is not surprising, because immigration controls are simply a means of central planning. A government board or a government legislature decides how many immigrants are going to come from each country, what their skills are going to be, what their qualifications are going to be. And this is just classic central planning. And central planning inevitably leads to distortions, perversions, chaos, and what Mises called planned chaos. The only thing that works is free markets, and which of course entails the free movements of people across borders. Free markets work. They harmonize people's interests. They bring people together who are each seeking their own self-interest, and they work out deals together for employment or housing or anything else that they find mutually agreeable. So that's the first point. Central planning, which encompasses immigration controls, doesn't work. It produces crises, it produces chaos. Free markets do work. They harmonize people's interests. Second point, immigration controls are antithetical to the principles of freedom. There is no way to reconcile immigration controls with basic fundamental principles of liberty. What we're talking about is economic liberty, the right of people to engage in mutually beneficial transactions with others, to seek employment with others, with people who are willing to hire them, freedom of association, where people want to associate with people from other countries. Immigration controls violate these fundamental principles. I own my own house. As the owner of my house, I have a right to invite anyone I want into my house. That doesn't mean that my guest has a right to trespass onto your property or enter into your home, but he has a right to come into my home if I'm inviting him into my home. Immigration controls interfere with that. They punish a person who is coming into my home without official permission if he's from a different country. Also, the immigration controls inevitably lead to a police state. We see this especially on the border in the Southwest. You have highway checkpoints that are entirely domestic. They're on the highways that run east-west near the border, where the immigration officials stop people, search their cars, ask for their papers. It's the same type of system that is found in totalitarian countries, where people are stopped arbitrarily on the highway by the police and asked to produce their papers. There's also roving border patrol checkpoints where they just stop people indiscriminately and search their vehicles and ask for their papers. There's warrantless trespasses of ranches and farms, not only along the border, but several miles from the border, where immigration officials just trespass onto people's property and search to see what's going on. You have raids on private businesses that are designed to arrest people who are there at the consent and invitation of the employer. And then, of course, you have this giant Berlin fence, or what Trump really wants to make into a Berlin Wall, which is really just a mirror image of the Berlin Wall. And so these are not the types of things that we generally associate with a free society. But they are inevitably part and parcel of immigration controls, because with immigration controls always come enforcement mechanisms, and enforcement mechanisms inevitably involve the initiation of force against peaceful people who are engaged in entirely nonviolent activities. Finally, or let me say finally, I have two more points. One more point is that uh, we see here domestically, here in the United States, that open borders work. I mean, thank goodness that our framers of the Constitution brought into existence a government that does not have the power to enact immigration or trade restrictions between the states, and the states don't have that authority either. I mean, it didn't have to be that way. The Constitution could be amended to allow states to enact trade restrictions, immigration controls, or travel restrictions between each state. That's not something we want. We have the biggest free trade and free movement zone in history here in the United States. And this increases people's standard of living. Is it risky? Of course it's risky. You've got criminals that can easily travel from Maryland into Virginia. You've got Virginians that can easily cross the border into Maryland and take jobs away from people in Maryland. You have trade deficits between Florida and Virginia. But we don't let any of this interfere with this principle of open borders that we have domestically. And this is one of the big reasons why Americans have a higher standard of living than most everyone else in the world. Finally, let me point out the hypocrisy of the left and the right on immigration controls. You see a lot of the left, the liberals, lamenting the Donald Trump suspension of the DACA program for Dreamers. But really, all that Trump's doing is enforcing the law that liberals support, and that law is immigration controls. Immigration controls say whoever comes into the country illegally is a criminal, and he's going to be subject to deportation. This is the law the liberals support. And so when they shed these crocodile tears for the Dreamers and so forth, they ignore a fundamental factor, and that is that they support the law that criminalizes the entry of these Dreamers into the United States. The hypocrisy is not limited to the left. It also it adheres to in the conservative movement. You hear conservatives, their favorite mantra is free markets, private property, and limited government. But then when it comes to immigration controls, the mantra goes out the window. Because here with open borders, you have free markets, you have limited government, you have private property, where people have private homes that they're renting or selling to immigrants, or private establishments where they're hiring them. And all of a sudden, conservatives just throw their mantra out the window and say, well, maybe this is one instance where we have to oppose free markets, private property, and limited government. And of course, it's not the only instance. There's a number of other instances like public schooling and Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security that conservatives also support that violate their mantra. So for these reasons, that central planning, immigration controls do not work. They can never work, no matter what plan anyone comes up with. And I challenge anyone to come up with a plan. Give me your ideal plan, and I will guarantee it will not work. It will produce chaos and crises. And because immigration controls are antithetical to the principles of freedom, and because freedom and free markets are our heritage as Americans, I say that we should just get rid of the system of immigration central planning and restore our philosophy, our founding philosophy of America, of open borders and open immigration. And with that, why don't we open it up for some discussion? Yeah.
How do you convince people of this who have so often just absolutely demonized foreigners in their mind?
I'm sorry, say that again?
How do you convince people that immigration isn't a bad thing when they have just absolutely demonized foreigners?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's always been a prejudice against foreigners. Keep in mind that the United States had a system of open borders or open immigration. There were trade restrictions and tariffs throughout the 1800s. But from the founding of the United States all the way up to the late 1800s, there was a system of open immigration. But there was also prejudice. There was prejudice against the Irish. There was prejudice against Italians, against Germans. So there's always that prejudice. I think what you have to do is appeal to people's sense of principle. That even though you might be opposed to this group, Mexicans or Nicaraguans or whatever, that we want a free society and we want a system that works. Why would, to me, it's totally impractical to support a system that is inherently defective. And so I think that's one of the best ways to convince people is that, okay, it's true, you may not like some people, but you don't have to associate with them. Just don't interfere with other people's right to associate with them. But a system of free markets and private property is what will guarantee us, or help guarantee us, lead us to a free society. And so therefore, that's the reason to support it, even though on a micro level, you might not like the particular people that are coming in.
I know one of the big arguments, even from libertarians and conservatives, is that that they'd be for open borders if it weren't for the welfare state. So you would still support open borders even with the large welfare state that we have?
Yeah, Milton Friedman made that argument. I think it's totally fallacious. I mean, the idea is that, the whole world's going to come here to get on welfare, and our taxes are going to go up, and we're going to end up having to support all these people on welfare. But most immigrants that come here want to work. I mean, it's not easy to leave your country. Even Americans who travel overseas know that it's not easy to go on vacation overseas. A lot of adjustments have to take place. And so most immigrants want to come here to make money. They leave their family, they leave their culture, their language. They come here and get a lot of abuse and harassment. But they come here for money, not to come on welfare. If you look at California, for example, California has extremely high welfare payments, but you don't have all of the United States moving to California to get on welfare, even though they could, because there's other things that people value. But also, as advocates of liberty, as libertarians, we never want to let statists maneuver us into abandoning our principles. What we have to do to lead the world of freedom is we have to continue adhering to our principles. And if that means higher taxes, so be it. But we have to continue focusing on ending the wrongdoing, not joining the wrongdoing. So we continue to focus on ending the welfare state. It's immoral, it's destructive. We focus on ending foreign interventionism, which is the cause of the anti-American terrorist blowback. And we continue adhering to our principles. An example of this, we libertarians oppose the drug war. Well, should we join the statists and support the drug war until Medicaid is abolished? Because just think, if drugs were legalized, a lot of poor people could go on Medicaid that are drug addicts, which could mean higher taxes. I say no. We continue fighting to legalize drugs, even with Medicaid still in existence, and we continue focusing on ending the wrongdoing, not joining up with the wrongdoers by advocating their statism.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? I'm also an international business major, so I like to think of these topics on an international scale. What are your thoughts on how, let's say, France or Germany have handled the immigrants from Syria or refugees from Syria and all those people?
Who have handled it? I'm sorry.
Germany.
Yeah.
Huh?
Europe, Germany in particular,
okay.
they have plenty of problems with those immigrants.
Okay. Yeah, massive refugee crisis. That we ought to first keep in mind what the cause of that refugee crisis is. I mean, it's not something normal. It's an aberrant consequence of U.S. interventionism. I mean, we've had 16 years of war in the Middle East, interventionism by the U.S. with its invasion and war of aggression against Iraq, a country that had never attacked the United States, against Libya, regime change operation, which is what the CIA and the Pentagon are devoted to, Syria. And so this massive chaos, violence has produced the refugee crisis. And these people are acting entirely rationally. They don't want to get bombed. They don't want their children to get bombed, their spouses to get bombed, their parents. And so they say, we need to get out of here to save our lives. But absent the interventionism, the refugee crisis would never have happened. And so, again, we need to focus on ending the wrongdoing, which is U.S. interventionism abroad. But let's face it, in normal times, you can also have refugee crises like this. You could have a war where people are fleeing the situation, or famines. And yeah, I think it's fantastic to have a system of open borders to help people out like that. I mean, that was really the system of the United States. That if you look at John Quincy Adams' famous speech, and I highly recommend you taking a look at that speech. It's his 4th of July speech to Congress in 1821. It's called "In Search of Monsters to Destroy." And John Quincy Adams says, look, there's a lot of monsters in the world: despots, dictatorships, famine, wars, revolutions, refugee crises. But America is not going to send troops abroad in search of those monsters to destroy. Instead, we're going to create a model society of freedom here at home for the world to emulate. Now, granted, there was a huge exception to that, slavery. But by and large, that was the ideal. And so there was a system of open immigration that where people fleeing these kind of things in Europe had a place to go where they did not worry about getting deported, sent back to their countries. And I think that's the ideal system. Now, the problem with Europe is that it's a massive welfare state. They have very little economic dynamism because of all their economic controls. And so they have a very difficult time absorbing immigrants. But in a truly unhampered market economy, immigrants are a tremendous boon. They're not a burden. They produce prosperity. They're like a gift to a society. And so, given refugee crises, America ought to just open up its borders. Well, open up its borders anyway, and welcome people. And this is the way you help people. You don't help people with this giant military-industrial complex and foreign interventionism and bombing and killing and destruction and invasions and regime change operations. You help people by providing a sanctuary for them.
Cool. Now, a couple of times, Jacob, you mentioned that while we all have the natural right to invite people onto our property, that also goes for any individual having the right to deny access to their property to any person on any ground. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay, now the problem, as Hans Hermann Hoppe, another Austrian and libertarian, I would even say anarcho-capitalist, points out in this case, is that we don't live in a world where everything is privately owned, and we have this massive government infrastructure which is paid for through coercive taxation of the citizens. And if those citizens don't want to, as you point out, associate with certain kinds of immigrants based on culture, maybe the way that they cook their meals and they smell too much of garlic, or whatever the reason is, it doesn't matter. However, the government opening the borders in this case presents us with this objection, a libertarian objection. Now you have the immigrants forcefully integrated into our society and being brought to live close to some of the individuals who don't want to be close to them. How do we rectify this situation? We have the infrastructure which those people can use for free without contributing initially to the payment of taxes, and they can come and move over to, say, our town here, Midland, live across from my home, and listen to loud music and, I don't know, sacrifice goats in the backyard and do all kinds of things which I might find objectionable. And in a privately owned Midland, we would maybe decide as a community not to have them in. Now the government would not allow us to exercise those rights. How do we fix that?
Well, in any society, it's going to be very difficult to find 100% pure libertarian society. There's always going to be some imperfections. I mean, we got the Postal Service, and I know a lot of libertarians use the Postal Service. But the fallacy of Hoppe's thoughts is reflected in an example that I addressed to him long ago that he has never been able to confront because it's simply not confrontable. And that is, assume you have two adjoining ranches on the border, let's say in Arizona. One is on the Mexican side and one is on the American side. And they're both privately owned. They're owned by brothers. And here you have just an artificial line separating these two privately owned properties. Let's say I own the American one and my brother owns the Mexican one, and let's assume he's a Mexican citizen. I invite my brother over for dinner at my house. The immigration controller's position is we have a right to send the government into your property to control that line. And my argument is, what are you talking about? There's no infrastructure here. There's no government ownership of roads here. You're trespassing onto my property simply because I've invited my brother. And it's even worse than that. They're going to initiate force against my brother, possibly kill him if he insists on just crossing this artificial line that is really just separating one huge tract of land that is owned by two separate people. I mean, let's assume there's not even a fence separating our two properties. Now, we live in a society where government owns the roads, government owns the bridges, but the immigrants that use these government facilities, they're just using them as a means to go from private property to private property. You don't have immigrants coming in and sleeping in public parks or establishing tents under public bridges. They use the roads as just a means to go from one private property to another private property. And the private property people who are inviting them up want them. It's their private property. It's their private business that they're employing them in. It's their private home that they're renting or they're selling. And so the idea is they're doing it out of their own self-interest. Now let's assume hypothetically that in the ideal libertarian world or anarcho-capitalist world that the roads are privately owned too. Well, you see, the assumption that Hoppe makes is that the private owner doesn't like immigrants because maybe he doesn't like immigrants. I think that's a fallacious assumption, because you have countless thousands, tens of thousands of private owners of businesses and homes that want to rent or hire immigrants. Why? Because it's in their self-interest to do so. There's no reason to believe why that owners of private roads would not want to sell the use of their roads to immigrants too. Most people like to make money, and more customers means more money. And so we can't just operate on the assumption that private owners of roads would discriminate against immigrants, given the fact that there's thousands of private owners of homes and businesses that want immigrants. And finally, when you say that in the community should be able to control who comes in, that's a denigration, a violation of the principle of fundamental rights. Now, if you want to establish a private sector development where you say we're not going to allow immigrants into here, fine. But in terms of a community, we have fundamental rights. We don't let communities by majority vote decide what people are going to be allowed into my home, what books I'm going to be permitted to read. We're talking about the principle of fundamental rights that are not subject to majority vote. And among those are freedom of travel, freedom of trade, and economic liberty.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jacob. The next speaker is waiting online. Thank you for joining us at this early hour.
My pleasure. Had a great time. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you for being again part of Freedom Week.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.